Chapter 1. The Garden, Fete, and the Window. The Morning of the St. Mary Mead. Garden Fete was one of those perfect English mornings that seem almost indecently well arranged. The sun hung lightly over the hedgerows, the air smelled faintly of roses and newly clipped grass, and the women of the village bustled about the vicarage garden with that purposeful energy that precedes both triumph and tragedy. Mrs. Dolly Bantry had, as usual, taken command of the cake stall, wearing an apron of violent pink and an expression of fierce good cheer. Beside her, Mrs. Price Ridley, who always disapproved of something, disapproved of the frosting consistency. Near the raffle table, Colonel Melchett's wife was pinning tickets with military precision, while the vicar's daughter fussed over the bunting that kept slipping from its hooks, and sitting, as she often did, beneath the shade of an elm tree, Miss Marple observed. She sat with her knitting, her eyes mild, and her manner almost apologetic. Yet there was nothing she missed, not the tight smile exchanged between Mrs. Price Ridley and the new lodger from the gray cottage, not the way young Thomas Reed, the postman, lingered too long near the lemonade table when Ruth Colby passed by, not even the way Mr. Lionel Quince, retired solicitor and self-styled guardian of village morals, glanced repeatedly at the vicarage window above the tea tent. That window, half opened and framed with lace curtains, seemed to interest him far more than the raffle prizes. Miss Marple's needles clicked quietly. "Such a pleasant day for it, isn't it?" came a voice beside her. It was Mrs. Bantry, glowing from effort and sugar. "Oh, yes," Miss Marple said, smiling faintly. "Quite perfect weather, though I dare say perfection is rarely without its price." Mrs. Bantry gave a little laugh. "You and your sayings, Jane. You'd have us all think a thunderstorm hides behind every rainbow." Miss Marple's gaze returned to the vicarage window. "Sometimes," she murmured, "it does." At precisely 3:30, as the raffle drum began to turn, and a child dropped a sponge cake, there came a sound that did not belong to such a cheerful afternoon. A sharp, splintering crash. Heads turned. Gasps fluttered through the crowd. A scream followed, a woman's. Then the unmistakable shout of the vicar himself. "Someone, fetch the doctor, quickly." The thought dissolved into confusion. Miss Marple rose from her chair, her eyes fixed on the source of the disturbance. The same window Mr. Quince had been so fascinated by. Its lace curtains now flapped wildly in the breeze, and one jagged pane was missing altogether. Within moments the crowd had gathered at the vicarage door. The vicar stood pale and trembling on the threshold, his hand stained with something dark. "It's Mr. Quince," he said hoarsely. "He's dead." A silence fell, heavy and stunned. Even the birds seemed to pause. Miss Marple, her knitting still looped over one hand, stepped quietly forward. "Through the window?" she asked softly. The vicar nodded. "Yes, through the window." And as the others rushed inside, whispering and exclaiming, Miss Marple looked up at the shattered glass and the curtain fluttering like a flag of surrender. "Windows," she said under her breath, "are such curious things. They let in light, and sometimes secrets too." Her eyes lingered on the frame for a long moment. Then, almost absently, she bent down to pick something from the grass. A single button, pearl gray, lying where no one else had thought to look. Chapter 2. The Village Reacts. By early evening, word of Mr. Quince's death had reached every parlor, pantry, and post office counter in St. Mary Mead. in a village where even the vicar's new pair of slippers could sustain a week's worth of conversation, the death of Lionel Quince was nothing short of an earthquake. Of course, no one said murder outright. Not yet. That would have been indelicate, and besides, it wasn't confirmed. Still, there was something in the air, a sense of collective unease that fluttered beneath every polite sentence. At the Blue Boar Inn, Mrs. Price Ridley was the first to break what she called the silence of shock. "Well," she said, leaning forward over her teacup, "I always said there was something peculiar about him. That man had the eyes of a hawk and the heart of a ferret, always watching people, always knowing too much." Beside her, Miss Hartnell gave a small gasp of approval. "He did have rather a way of asking questions, didn't he? And not the sort one expects from a gentleman of his standing." "Standing?" Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed. "A retired solicitor with no family, no visitors, and a fondness for peering into windows? Standing, indeed." At which Miss Hartnell pursed her lips and said, "Still, no one deserves to die so suddenly." Across the table, Mr. Pritchard, the butcher's husband, and unofficial chronicler of village affairs, lowered his paper and said darkly, "They say he fell. Through the window straight onto the flagstones below. Broke his neck clean as a whistle." A collective shudder passed among them. "Fell?" said Mrs. Price Ridley, lowering her voice. "Or was pushed?" No one replied at first. The fire popped in the grate. Somewhere beyond the window, a bicycle bell tinkled down the lane. Then Miss Hartnell whispered, "Who would do such a thing?" It was a good question, though no one in the Blue Boar that evening could answer it. At the same hour, Miss Marple was in her own neat little cottage, seated by the fire with her knitting once again in her lap. She had said very little at the fete, and even less afterward. The constable who came to make inquiries, young Sergeant Mayhew, still new to the district, had been polite, but overwhelmed. He had spoken in the uncertain tone of a man rehearsing authority. "An accident, most likely, Miss Marple. Tragic, of course, but nothing sinister." Miss Marple had smiled gently. "Of course, dear, accidents do happen." But she had not sounded convinced. Now, with her teacup cooling beside her and the shadows lengthening across the room, she reflected on the day's events. Mr. Quince had been a methodical man, careful in speech, cautious in judgment, and not given to sudden movements. She remembered his shoes, always polished, his handwriting small and exact, his manner reserved but never impolite. A man like that did not lean too far out of a window by mistake. Her needles paused mid-air. And then there was the matter of the button. It lay now on the small table by her lamp, gleaming faintly in the firelight. Pearl gray, with a faint scratch along its rim, as though it had been torn free in haste. She considered it for a long while, then resumed her knitting with a small, knowing sigh. "People," she murmured, "are so very careless when they believe no one is watching." The next morning brought not calm but curiosity. The inquest was to be held at the vicarage that afternoon, temporarily converted into an impromptu office of justice. The village turned out in force. To miss it would have been social suicide. Miss Marple arrived quietly, dressed in subdued gray, and took her seat near the back. From her position she could see the window clearly, the same one through which poor Mr. Quince had fallen. It had been hastily boarded over, though one could still glimpse the jagged edge of glass near the corner. The coroner, a solemn man from Much Benham, cleared his throat and began proceedings. Statements were taken. The vicar, who had discovered the body, Mrs. Bantry, who had heard the crash, young Thomas Reed, who claimed to have seen a shadow move past the window just before it broke. Each voice carried its own tremor of importance, its own version of events. Miss Marple listened, her eyes half closed, the faintest smile of polite attention upon her lips. When Mrs. Bantry was called, she took the chair with the air of a woman accustomed to both managing and narrating drama. "I was by the cake stall," she began, "when I heard the most dreadful noise, glass shattering, people shouting, that sort of thing. Naturally, I ran to help. Poor Mr. Quince was lying there, oh, quite still, and the vicar was trying to lift him. It was horrible, really. Did you notice anyone nearby, Mrs. Bantry?" the coroner asked. Mrs. Bantry hesitated. "Well, not directly, though I could have sworn I saw Mrs. Price Ridley hurrying away from that side of the house, but of course she may simply have been fetching someone." A murmur rippled through the room. Mrs. Price Ridley stiffened like a soldier under fire. "That is an outrageous suggestion," she declared. "I was assisting the vicar's wife with the tea service. Everyone saw me." Miss Marple's gaze flicked briefly to her, then back to the window. The inquest continued. After 2 hours of conflicting recollections and nervous glances, the coroner gave his verdict, death by misadventure. The official words hung in the air, heavy and unsatisfying. People filed out, murmuring condolences, their faces solemn, yet eager for gossip, once they reached the safety of the lane. Only Miss Marple lingered. She moved closer to the window, standing just beneath the broken frame. A faint smear darkened the stone beneath it. Not blood exactly, more a trace of something darker, like soot. "Odd," she said softly. "Very odd indeed." Behind her, the vicar approached. His hands were clasped, his face drawn with worry. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "you don't think, well, that there's more to this, do you?" She looked at him with her gentle, almost apologetic smile. "More, dear Reverend. There's always more. Only sometimes it hides behind the curtains." He blinked, unsure how to respond. Miss Marple nodded toward the window. "You might have that curtain examined. Someone's hand seems to have gripped it very tightly." The vicar followed her gaze and frowned. "Do you truly believe?" But when he turned again, she was already stepping toward the door, her knitting bag swinging softly at her side. That evening, the village gathered again in drawing rooms and parlors, trading theories like cards. Mrs. Price Ridley insisted she had been nowhere near the window. Mrs. Bantry declared she hadn't said she was guilty, merely nearby. The postman's shadow grew in importance with every retelling, and in the midst of it all, Miss Marple sat by her window, gazing out over the quiet lane. A thin mist was rising from the fields, blurring the edges of everything. She thought again of the button, of the soot-like mark beneath the window, and of the curious fact that no one could quite recall why Mr. Quince had gone upstairs in the middle of the fete. There was something there, a thread, faint but unbroken. And as she laid aside her knitting for the night, she said softly, "People think death begins with a fall, but it never does. It begins much earlier, often with a whisper no one remembers hearing." Outside, the mist thickened, pressing against the glass like a living thing, and in one of the darkened cottages across the lane, a curtain moved ever so slightly. Chapter the 3 Early investigation. The morning after the garden fete, St. Mary Mead awoke under a blanket of low gray clouds, as if the heavens themselves had taken offense at the recent tragedy. Even the birds seemed subdued, their song fragmented and hesitant. In the village, conversation immediately returned to Mr. Quince, though now tinged with speculation rather than shock. Miss Marple, however, took a quiet approach. She walked slowly through the village, her eyes catching the subtle gestures, the small hesitations, the minutiae that most people dismissed as inconsequential. Her destination was the vicarage, but her mind flitted from detail to detail. The fresh footprints along the lane, the way a hedge had been recently trimmed, the peculiar angle of a neighbor's shutter. At the vicarage, she found Sergeant Mayhew pacing near the steps, his notebook in hand and his expression taut with the tension of inexperience. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, a little too formally. "I'm just reviewing statements from yesterday. Still seems straightforward. Tragic accident, as we thought. Though," he hesitated, "though Mrs. Bantry mentioned seeing something odd near the window." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Odd? How so?" "Just a shadow. Someone moving quickly, but she couldn't be certain. And Thomas Reed, the postman, mentioned a shadow too, but his timing didn't match hers exactly. It's confusing, really." Miss Marple nodded, her hands lightly clasped. "Yes, timing can be misleading. Shadows are deceptive. Sometimes what one sees depends more on expectation than reality." He looked at her, unsure whether she was agreeing or merely philosophizing. "Would you mind if I had a look at that window?" she asked. "Of course," the sergeant said, though his eyebrows rose at the request. "Though there's little to see. Board it over now." Miss Marple stepped carefully to the base of the window. She studied the jagged edges of the glass, the way the curtain had caught, and the faint discoloration along the frame where someone's hand might have pressed. Then her eyes fell to the ground. There, half hidden under a clump of grass, was another button, smaller than the one she had retrieved at the fete, darker, almost charcoal in color. "Interesting," she murmured. Sergeant Mayhew frowned. "Another button? Do you think it belonged to Mr. Quince?" Miss Marple shook her head. "No, dear. A man like him would not wear buttons so small or so dark. This is a lady's button. Perhaps someone who wears gloves sometimes, but not always." The sergeant's pen hovered over the notebook. "Do you think it's a clue?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. She was too busy noticing other things. A faint scratch along the wooden sill, the way the board covering the window had been nailed unevenly, the subtle imprint of what might have been a footprint above the flower bed. "All accidents leave traces," she said finally. "Some are easy to see, some much less so." After her examination at the vicarage, Miss Marple continued through the village. Her first stop was Grey Cottage, the home of the new lodger whom Mrs. Price Ridley had been watching so closely during the fete. The house was small, neatly kept, and smelled faintly of lavender and dusted floors. Mrs. Price Ridley had accused the lodger of being near the window, though Miss Marple had no reason to think her words entirely truthful. Still, curiosity demanded verification. She knocked lightly. A young woman answered, polite and composed, with a faint trace of concern in her eyes. "Good morning," Miss Marple said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I hope I am not disturbing you. I merely wanted to ask a few questions about yesterday. The fate, the accident." The lodger nodded, guiding her into a small sitting room. "I saw nothing unusual, Miss Marple. I was in the kitchen preparing tea when the commotion began. By the time I got outside, everyone was running toward the vicarage." "Did you see anyone near the vicarage window before that?" "No," she said firmly. "I was busy, and I was alone in the house. I didn't even look out the front." Miss Marple inclined her head. She noted the precise manner in which the young woman's hands rested in her lap, the slight tremor in her voice when she said alone, and the faint smudge on the cuff of her sleeve. Something had touched that sleeve recently. Not dirt exactly, but dust from a surface disturbed hastily. "Thank you," Miss Marple said gently. "You've been most helpful." She left Grey Cottage with a growing sense that there was more than met the eye. People rarely acted with such precision unless they were accustomed to hiding something. By midday, Miss Marple had returned home, her mind quietly spinning threads from the village tapestry. She arranged her buttons carefully on a small dish, separating them by color and size, and began to knit again, though her hands were not idle in thought. A knock at the door drew her attention. It was young Thomas Reed, the postman. His cap was slightly askew, and he held a small parcel in his hands. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, looking nervously at her. I thought you might like to see this." He handed her the parcel. Inside was a notebook, apparently belonging to Mr. Quince. The pages were filled with neat, small handwriting, meticulous and precise, detailing appointments, notes about villagers, and observations of daily life in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple flipped through it carefully. Most entries were banal, almost painfully ordinary, but one caught her attention. A note, written only days before his death. "Something off about the vicarage window. Will watch." "Did he say this to anyone?" she asked Thomas. "No, miss. I found the notebook by accident while delivering a letter to the vicarage yesterday. Thought it might help someone." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It certainly does. Thank you, dear. That was very considerate of you." As Thomas left, she returned to the window seat in her cottage. The notebook, the buttons, the soot-like mark beneath the vicarage window. They were all pieces of a puzzle. None of them could alone solve the mystery. But together. Her eyes traced the shadows creeping across her garden. Even now, she thought she saw the faintest movement of a curtain across the lane. "Yes," she murmured to herself. "It is never a simple accident, not when people's secrets are involved, and every secret leaves a trace." For the first time, she felt the quiet thrill of anticipation, the careful, patient excitement of a mind assembling a complex pattern before anyone else even knew it existed. And in that moment, Miss Marple knew that she would need to watch, to listen, and above all, to wait, because in St. Mary Mead, the smallest gesture could hide the deepest treachery. Chapter 4. First suspects. By the third day after Mr. Quince's fall, St. Mary Mead was alive with conjecture. The village, usually so serene and measured, buzzed with a tension that seemed almost visible, like a thin mist settling over the lanes. Conversations in parlors, post offices, and garden gates circled around two persistent questions: who and why? Miss Marple naturally heard everything. She walked slowly along the high street, nodding politely at acquaintances, while her mind catalogued every detail. Mrs. Price Ridley's sharp eyes flicked over her as she passed, and Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of her lips. Curiosity, suspicion, or guilt? perhaps all three. Her first stop was the vicarage, where the inquest had been adjourned until later in the week. The vicar himself was pacing in the small study, wringing his hands. "Jane," he said, seeing her, "I don't know what to do. Everyone seems to suspect everyone else, and I feel responsible somehow." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Dear Reverend, guilt rarely belongs to one person alone, but it is remarkable how quickly suspicion spreads in a village. It is like a seed sown in fertile soil." He frowned, unconvinced. "I suppose, but surely someone must have done this deliberately." She tilted her head, letting her voice remain light. "Perhaps, or perhaps not. Sometimes people imagine a hand behind the wind when it is merely the breeze." The vicar sighed. "I wish I had your certainty." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the window just above them. "Certainty, dear Reverend, is rarely necessary. Observation, patience, and attention to human behavior, those are far more reliable." Outside, the villagers had already begun to form their own theories. Mr. Pritchard, the butcher's husband, had taken it upon himself to approach Sergeant Mayhew with a list of suspicious types. "First, there's that young lodger at Grey Cottage," he said in a low voice. "Never seen her before the fete, keeps to herself, and now, the day after, Mr. Quince is dead. Coincidence? I think not." The sergeant nodded politely, taking notes, though his expression betrayed uncertainty. "Yes, well, I suppose it is possible. But she claims to have been in the kitchen all afternoon." "Ah, but kitchens are easily faked," Mr. Pritchard whispered, leaning closer. "And who knows what a small window might show?" Miss Marple, standing quietly to the side, overheard the conversation. She said nothing, only noting Mr. Pritchard's excitement, the way he leaned in, as though the air itself might carry secrets. By midday, the vicar had received another visitor, Mrs. Bantry, radiant and anxious in equal measure. She had been approached by half the village already, all eager to know what she had seen. "Mr. Quince was a dear man, of course," she said, smoothing her apron, "but there were those who envied him. Lionel had a way of making people uncomfortable, you know, pointing out their mistakes, their little secrets. I've heard whispers. Whispers can be misleading," Miss Marple said softly, settling into a chair near the window. Mrs. Bantry hesitated, glancing at the curtain, fluttering faintly in the breeze. "Still, I wouldn't put it past someone to take matters into their own hands. He did upset a few people recently. You know, legal disputes, property matters. Lionel could be persistent." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze sweeping across the room. Every person who had visited the vicarage in the past 2 days seemed, in some measure, guilty in someone's eyes, but appearance and reality were rarely the same. That afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the post office. Thomas Reed, the postman, was sorting letters with a distracted air. "Thomas," she said kindly, "did you notice anything unusual the day of the fete?" He shifted nervously. "Well, Miss Marple, I don't rightly know. I did see a figure moving near the vicarage window, but it was only for a moment, and I can't be certain who it was." "Were there any other details you recall? Perhaps the way the figure moved, or clothing?" Thomas thought for a moment. Yes, they were wearing gloves. Dark gloves, like the sort ladies wear when it's chilly, and the person moved very quickly, like they were trying not to be seen." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. She made no comment, merely thanked him, and walked slowly back toward her cottage. That tiny detail, the gloves, the careful, deliberate movement, was a thread worth following. By evening, gossip had reached fever pitch. Mrs. Price Ridley was convinced it had been an accident, but only because she wished it so. Mr. Pritchard, true to form, had assembled a list of likely perpetrators, including the lodger, Thomas Reed, and even the vicar's wife. Miss Marple, seated quietly with her knitting once more, noted the contrasts, the certainty with which some accused, the fear with which others avoided comment, and the subtle ways people tried to conceal their interest. She paused, mid-stitch, the soot-like mark beneath the window, the 2 buttons she had discovered, the movement of shadows. All these small observations formed a picture, though its outlines were still blurred. Her mind drifted back to Mr. Quince's notebook and the brief note he had made about the vicarage window. Someone had disturbed that window recently. Someone had pressed a hand against the sill, had perhaps lost a button, had made a mark that no one else had noticed. And yet, she reminded herself, these were not the actions of a stranger. These were the actions of someone familiar with both the house and its occupant. She leaned back in her chair, considering the villagers she had already observed. The lodger at Grey Cottage, Mrs. Price Ridley, Mr. Pritchard, even the vicar himself, each had a motive or an opportunity, or at least appeared to, in the eyes of the village. But Miss Marple's keen mind sifted through the noise. Motive alone was not enough. Opportunity alone could not explain the precise nature of the incident. No, the truth would reveal itself only through careful attention to human behavior, to the tiny inconsistencies that everyone else overlooked. She picked up her knitting again, her hands moving mechanically while her mind worked quietly. The first suspects are often the most obvious, she murmured, but they are rarely the ones who leave behind the quietest traces. Outside, the wind rattled the remaining panes of the vicarage window. A shadow moved behind the curtain, fleeting and uncertain, as if it were testing the waters. Miss Marple's gaze followed it briefly, calm and deliberate. She knew already that someone was watching, and that the smallest slip, the tiniest reveal, would be enough to guide her to the truth. For now, though, she waited. Patience, as always, was her most effective tool. Chapter 5. A Hidden Clue. By the 5th day after Mr. Quince's death, St. Mary Mead had settled into a peculiar rhythm. The initial shock of the incident had faded, replaced by a quiet, almost restless curiosity. Conversation shifted seamlessly from everyday matters to speculation about the event and its possible explanations. And yet, to most villagers, the incident remained a tragic accident. Only one person saw the faint outlines of something far more deliberate. Miss Marple, as always, observed. She began her morning with a walk through the vicarage garden. The air was crisp, the dew still clinging to petals and leaves, and the faint scent of roses lingered where it had not been trampled. She moved slowly, almost aimlessly, yet each step was calculated to let her eyes rest on overlooked details. Her attention fell upon the flower bed beneath the vicarage window. Yesterday, she had noted a faint imprint in the soil, barely visible to anyone else. Today, with the sun striking the ground at a different angle, it became clearer. A shoe had pressed deeply into the soft earth, leaving a distinct tread. "Ah," she murmured, crouching to inspect it. Not accidental at all. The tread was small, delicate even, suggesting a light step, Certainly not the stride of a man like Mr. Quince. It was, she decided, the step of someone accustomed to moving quietly, perhaps someone trying not to be noticed. Later that morning she visited Grey Cottage once more. The lodger had been tidy, quiet, and polite in their earlier conversation, yet Miss Marple felt that subtle tension lingered like the echo of a distant note. "Good morning," Miss Marple said, stepping lightly over the threshold. "I hope I am not disturbing you again." "Not at all," the lodger replied, though her hands fidgeted with the edge of a teacup. "Please, come in." Miss Marple studied her as they sat by the window. There was nothing overt, no confession waiting on her lips, but the smallest gestures often revealed the deepest truths. The lodger's fingers traced the rim of the cup repeatedly, as if seeking reassurance. Her gaze occasionally darted to the window above, and then away, almost as if expecting someone to appear. "Do you often look at that window?" Miss Marple asked casually. The lodger froze. "Sometimes. It's a habit, I suppose. One notices things from windows." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Windows are peculiar. They let in light, and sometimes they let out more than one in tens." The lodger smiled faintly, nervous and uncertain. "I suppose so, yes." Miss Marple nodded. She had no reason yet to suspect this young woman of wrongdoing, but the tension in her hands and the careful avoidance of the vicarage's window spoke volumes about her awareness of its significance. Returning home, Miss Marple spent the afternoon at her desk, examining the buttons she had collected and the pages of Mr. Quince's notebook. She compared them carefully, noting the sequence of observations he had recorded, the small emphasis he had placed on the vicarage window, and the brief mention of shadows and movement. The notebook was meticulous in its detail, but in its very precision lay a hidden clue. A single page, where the handwriting, usually small and controlled, had shifted slightly. Letters, larger, hurried, and with an almost imperceptible tremor. "Curious," she murmured. "Even meticulous people betray themselves when something unsettles them." She laid the notebook down and returned to the buttons. There were 3 now in total: the pearl gray one found at the fete, the smaller charcoal one near the flower bed, and a tiny dark button discovered this morning near the vicarage gate. Each had its own character, its own story. Miss Marple considered them in turn. The first suggested elegance, a lady accustomed to social gatherings. The second was smaller, understated, almost utilitarian. The third was tiny, almost insignificant. Yet it had fallen where few would tread. Patterns, she realized, could be found in the smallest details. And someone, somewhere, had left these traces, intentionally or through carelessness. Either way, they were the silent witnesses to the events of that tragic afternoon. That evening, she took a walk through the lane behind the vicarage. The village was quiet, the sun dipping low, casting long shadows across hedges and rooftops. She paused beneath the vicarage window, her gaze sweeping over the scene with a practiced eye. Something disturbed her attention. A faint smudge on the lower pane of glass, too high for a child, too light for a man, suggested a hand had pressed there, perhaps to steady itself. She traced it mentally against the buttons and the footprints she had noted earlier. Someone had climbed or leaned in such a way that left only subtle traces, imperceptible to those not looking closely. Miss Marple tapped her fingers together lightly. "Interesting," she murmured. Everything points to intention, not accident. And yet, the person responsible has been careful, very careful indeed. As she turned to leave, she noticed movement from across the lane. A curtain stirred in the window of a neighboring house, a fleeting shadow that disappeared as quickly as it appeared. Miss Marple paused, a small smile touching her lips. "Patience," she whispered. "That is always the key. One must let the threads unravel at their own pace. The most careful deception eventually slips." She returned home with a quiet determination. In her mind, the puzzle was beginning to take shape. Footprints, buttons, the notebook, the faint marks on the window, each a thread weaving toward a pattern. By nightfall, the village had settled into its usual rhythm again. The whispers of suspicion persisted. Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting in hand, and allowed herself a moment to reflect. "People are like windows themselves," she said softly, "opaque to the casual glance, but revealing to those who know how to look. And every secret leaves a mark, sooner or later." Somewhere in the village, another hand fidgeted nervously with a button, unaware that it had already betrayed the owner. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly in the firelight. She was beginning to see the pattern, and the person responsible, careful, deliberate, yet inevitably human, would soon show themselves in a way they could not control. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. The week following Mr. Quince's death brought a subtle shift in St. Mary Mead. The initial shock had dulled, replaced by murmurs of suspicion, whispered exchanges in parlors, and discreet glances along the high street. What had once been polite curiosity had evolved into a tense awareness. The village now knew that accidents rarely occurred in complete isolation. Miss Marple, ever patient, watched the unfolding tapestry with quiet attention. She began her morning with a call at the Bantry household, seeking nothing more than a cup of tea and an excuse to observe. Mrs. Bantry greeted her warmly, though a faint tension lingered beneath her smile. "Good morning, Jane. Do sit down. I've been thinking, of course, about the dreadful event. It's unsettling, isn't it?" "Very unsettling," Miss Marple agreed, letting her eyes drift over the room. She noticed at once the slight crease in Mrs. Bantry's forehead, the way her fingers lingered over the teacup, and the carefully arranged flowers on the table. Flowers that seemed too perfect to be entirely natural. Subtle signs, small gestures that often spoke more than words. "You see," Mrs. Bantry continued, lowering her voice as though confessing a great secret, "there were disagreements in the village long before the fete. Mr. Quince, he had a way of making people uncomfortable. Perhaps some took offense at something trivial. You know how easily grudges form in a small community." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her attention fixed on a tiny smudge near the windowsill. "Yes, grudges often hide in plain sight," she murmured, "and sometimes the smallest provocation can ignite a larger response." Later that day, she visited Grey Cottage again. The lodger, whose composure had been impeccable during previous visits, seemed more tense now. Her movements were precise, deliberate, but there was a subtle stiffness in her shoulders and a hesitation in her speech. "I hope I am not intruding, Miss Marple," the lodger said politely. "But I've had visitors asking questions, and well, it is difficult to explain everything." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I understand. Some questions are easier answered than others, but there is no hurry. Observing quietly can reveal far more than pressing for a confession. The lodger shifted slightly. It's just that I was in the village only a short time before the fate, and now everything feels exposed. Miss Marple's eyes rested on a faint mark on the corner of the table, a slight scratch as though someone had brushed against it nervously. She noted it silently, another small piece of the puzzle. Exposure, Miss Marple said softly, has a way of revealing what people would otherwise keep hidden. Often it is the nervous gestures, the small inconsistencies, that speak loudest. The lodger looked away, and Miss Marple knew her observation was received, understood without words. Back in the village, gossip spread like wildfire. Mrs. Price Ridley had already taken to warning neighbors of potential dangers, pointing fingers subtly while maintaining the guise of concern. "Accidents do happen, of course," she said primly at the post office, "but one must be cautious. Windows, particularly upstairs, are deceptively treacherous, and some people are not as careful as they appear." Thomas Reed, the postman, listened nervously, unsure whether to nod or protest. He had already mentioned seeing a shadow near the window, but the village's readiness to speculate made him reluctant to add more. Miss Marple, arriving quietly, intercepted a conversation between Mrs. Price Ridley and Mr. Pritchard. Both were animated, though each seemed to operate under a veil of civility. "It was certainly suspicious," Mr. Pritchard said, in a low voice. "Whoever it was, they moved with purpose. One could see it in the shadow, even from across the lane." Mrs. Price Ridley nodded vigorously. "Yes, but people are clever. Too clever sometimes. One cannot always rely on appearances alone." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. She said nothing, but the small, almost imperceptible smile that touched her lips suggested she had taken note of every word. That evening she returned to her cottage and laid out the buttons she had collected, the faint scratch marks she had observed, and the notes from Mr. Quince's notebook. Patterns were beginning to emerge. The buttons suggested more than one person. The marks indicated deliberate contact, and the notebook, with its careful entries, hinted at unease that had been brewing even before the fate. She considered the villagers she had observed most closely, the lodger quiet and reserved, but aware of the window; Mrs. Bantry, sociable yet protective of her own knowledge; Mrs. Price Ridley, always ready with a cautious warning; Mr. Pritchard, eager for involvement and easily excited. Each had motives, or at least appeared to, yet none could account entirely for the precise way Mr. Quince had come to his end. Her eyes wandered back to the vicarage window. Something remained hidden there, something that only the smallest observation could reveal. She recalled Thomas Reed's description of the gloves, the tiny button, and the faint trace on the sill. She had seen similar gestures before in her long experience with human nature, the tension in a hand, the slight hesitation before speech, the careful concealment of what one hoped no one else would notice. Secrets, Miss Marple reflected, were like dust in a room. They accumulated, settled, and left traces, even when the owner believed they had been swept away. And in St. Mary Mead, those traces were plentiful. Miss Marple decided to visit the vicar once more. She found him in the study, frowning over parish accounts, but distracted by his own unease. "Jane," he said, looking up, "I feel as though the village is closing in. People look at one another with suspicion, and I cannot decide what is true and what is imagined." Miss Marple smiled gently. "That is the nature of small communities, dear Reverend. Suspicion is a living thing. It moves, spreads, and reveals what we most wish to conceal." He nodded, though the lines on his face betrayed uncertainty. "Perhaps," Miss Marple continued, "you might allow me to speak to a few people quietly, just for clarity, you understand. Not accusation, merely understanding. Sometimes, by asking the right questions, one discovers more than by direct observation, alone." The vicar hesitated, then sighed. "Very well. I trust your judgment, Jane." Miss Marple left the study with a sense of purpose. She knew that the next few days would be crucial. Confrontations would reveal truths, subtle hints would surface, and the careful observance of human behavior would begin to untangle the web of suspicion surrounding Mr. Quince's death. That night, she sat by her fire with knitting in hand, reflecting on the day's interactions. The village, she thought, had revealed more in its gestures, its careful avoidance, and its whispered warnings than it ever could through overt confession. She picked up the pearl gray button and turned it in her fingers. One person had lost it during the events of the fete, and that loss would not go unnoticed in their own mind. She considered the other buttons as well, connecting them in her mind to shadows, marks, and gestures observed in the past days. "Yes," she murmured to herself, "the threads are beginning to show, and the knot, the final truth, will reveal itself soon enough." Outside, the wind rattled faintly against the vicarage windows. A curtain moved, almost imperceptibly, and Miss Marple's eyes followed it. She did not hurry, did not call attention, only noted the timing and movement. In small details, the story of Mr. Quince's death would ultimately unfold, and she would be ready to see it clearly. Chapter 7. Another twist. St. Mary Mead awoke to a morning that felt unusually still, as if the village itself were holding its breath. The week following Mr. Quince's death had been filled with muted speculation, but nothing prepared anyone for the development that now rippled quietly through the streets. Miss Marple, as always, had already heard the news from her neighbors before the official word reached the vicarage. It was Sergeant Mayhew who confirmed it formally, looking more uneasy than usual. "Miss Marple," he said when she arrived at the vicarage, "there's been another incident." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, keeping her voice light. "Another accident, do you mean?" The sergeant shook his head. "No accident. Mr. Quince's solicitor, Mr. Aldridge, received an anonymous letter overnight. It claims knowledge of the circumstances surrounding Mr. Quince's death. Nothing threatening, but cryptic enough to worry us." Miss Marple leaned against the doorway, her eyes narrowing slightly. Cryptic letters often say more about the writer than the subject. Did it mention any names? "None," Sergeant Mayhew admitted, "but it does suggest that someone in the village knows more than they are admitting, and it urges caution for anyone involved in the inquest." Miss Marple nodded. Her mind ticked over the possibilities. Whoever sent the letter had knowledge of Mr. Quince's routines, his habits, and likely the timing of the accident, or murder, as she now began to suspect. By mid-morning, the village was abuzz with hushed talk. Mrs. Price Ridley was quick to share her suspicions with anyone who would listen. "Did you hear?" she whispered to Mrs. Bantry over tea. "A letter, written in secret. Someone knows more than they admit. I told you, it cannot have been an accident. I always suspected that window, and now this. Well, it confirms my fears." Mrs. Bantry raised her brows, but remained polite. "Yes, quite unsettling. But we mustn't jump to conclusions. People's imaginations often run faster than events." Miss Marple, quietly knitting in a corner, observed their conversation. Mrs. Price Ridley's eagerness, Mrs. Bantry's measured caution, the slight tightening of hands and lips, each small signal added to her growing understanding of the village's dynamics. Later that afternoon, she visited the post office to speak with Thomas Reed. The young man was visibly anxious, sorting letters with trembling hands. "Thomas," Miss Marple began gently, "have you noticed anyone unusual moving about the village lately? Perhaps someone paying more attention than they should?" Thomas hesitated, then whispered, I did see someone near the vicarage window yesterday evening. Not the lodger. Someone taller, with a coat that looked too large. They moved quickly and then disappeared down the lane." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed faintly. The details aligned with the small, deliberate marks she had observed at the window. A handprint, a faint smear, the tiny button. Someone else had been there. Someone careful, deliberate, and intent on remaining unseen. "Did you notice their hands?" she asked softly. Thomas shook his head. "No, but they were in a hurry, too quick to see." Miss Marple nodded. "Thank you, Thomas. You've been very helpful." She walked home, slowly, pondering the implications. The anonymous letter, the fleeting figure, the unnoticed traces, all pointed to someone trying to manipulate suspicion. The real culprit was clever, careful, and patient. But even the most patient cannot avoid leaving every trace unnoticed. By evening, Miss Marple had received an unexpected visitor, the lodger from Grey Cottage. She entered without invitation, appearing unusually determined. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice low, "I felt I should tell you something. Something I should have mentioned earlier. It concerns the window at the vicarage." Miss Marple gestured gently for her to sit. "Go on, my dear. There is no hurry. Speak as freely as you can." The lodger's hands trembled slightly. I didn't want to say before because I feared being blamed. But I did see someone shortly before Mr. Quince fell. They were at the window, quickly, briefly. I thought it was nothing, but now I'm not so sure." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And this figure? Did you see anything else? Clothing? Gestures?" "A coat, dark, too large, and gloves. They moved with intention, but I couldn't see their face." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. Every detail reinforced what she had suspected. Someone had deliberately approached the window, left subtle traces, and ensured no one saw them clearly. "You've been very brave to tell me this," Miss Marple said kindly, "and your honesty now is far more useful than fear ever was." That night she returned home, arranging the buttons, the notebook, and the recollections of the day. The village had now offered her 2 new threads to follow, the anonymous letter and the brief appearance of a tall figure near the vicarage window. She reflected on human nature. People, she thought, often assume that others act in the same manner as themselves, careless, clumsy, obvious. But clever people are patient. They calculate, observe, and wait for the right moment. Even so, they leave hints, the smallest indications of their presence. Miss Marple reviewed the timeline in her mind. Mr. Quince at the fete, the shadows observed by Mrs. Bantry, and Thomas Reed, the buttons, the smudges, the handprint, the brief appearance of the figure. Each piece formed a pattern only discernible to careful observation. Yes, she whispered to herself, the threads are converging, but the final knot is still hidden. Soon, though, soon the cleverest deception will falter. Outside, the wind stirred gently through the trees. A faint flicker of shadow passed across her window, disappearing as quickly as it appeared. Miss Marple's keen eyes followed it for a moment. She did not rush, did not call attention. She only waited, confident that human nature would eventually betray even the most careful hand. And when it did, she would be ready. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's Final Test. By the following morning, Miss Marple had resolved upon a subtle plan. She would not confront anyone directly, for a confrontation often drove the guilty to deceitful ingenuity. Instead, she would watch, prompt, and observe the small signs that could not be faked. Hesitation, gesture, the flicker of a guilty conscience. She began her day at the vicarage garden, where the sun caught the dew on the roses and the faint shadow of the window above. The garden was quiet, save for a few early risers tending their lawns or walking their dogs. Miss Marple, knitting quietly on a bench, let her eyes roam. She noticed Mr. Pritchard, moving down the lane with his usual briskness, glancing repeatedly toward the vicarage. Curiosity or concern? She murmured under her breath. Soon Mrs. Bantry appeared, gathering flowers near the hedge. Her steps were deliberate, yet her eyes darted toward the window as though half expecting someone to be there. Miss Marple allowed a soft smile. Observation, she knew, was often more revealing than interrogation. By mid-morning she had arranged a chance encounter with the lodger from Grey Cottage. "Good morning," Miss Marple said, approaching as if casually strolling by. "I was wondering if you might accompany me to the vicarage. I thought some fresh air might do us both good." The lodger looked hesitant, but agreed. As they walked, Miss Marple spoke of trivial matters, the weather, the flowers in the garden, the unexpected chill of the morning. Yet, beneath her gentle tones, she embedded small, pointed questions about the fate, the movements around the vicarage window, and observations of shadows. The lodger answered honestly, almost without realizing the significance of her own words. Miss Marple listened, knitting mental notes with careful precision. "Do you recall anyone acting strangely that afternoon?" she asked innocently. The lodger hesitated, then said quietly, I saw a figure near the window, as I mentioned before, but they were careful to avoid being noticed. I don't know who it was." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes, I suppose some people are careful to the point of cunning, and yet even the most careful leave traces, footprints, smudges, small overlooked details." The lodger's eyes flickered toward her, and Miss Marple noted the faint tightening of the jaw, the subtle tension in the fingers. They were not guilty, she decided, but they were aware. They had seen more than they initially revealed. By afternoon, Miss Marple had moved on to more direct observation of Mr. Pritchard and Mrs. Price Ridley. She arranged a casual tea in the vicarage parlor, inviting them both. Conversation flowed lightly, covering minor village news, the latest gossip, and Mrs. Price Ridley's complaints about the uneven hedges. Yet Miss Marple sprinkled her remarks carefully, each comment a small probe, testing reactions. "Windows are strange things," she said lightly, watching their faces. They let in light, but they also let out shadows. One sees many things from them, if one knows where to look. Mrs. Price Ridley's lips tightened. Yes, well, I should hope one looks only at what is necessary. Mr. Pritchard coughed nervously. Indeed, one shouldn't pry where it's not one's business. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. True, yet sometimes what appears trivial at first glance, like a shadow or a smudge, can reveal the most important truths. Even a small mark, a slight disturbance, or a forgotten button. The two exchanged glances, each uncomfortably aware that Miss Marple was speaking as much to them as she was to herself. Their reactions, subtle as they were, told her more than any confession could. Later that day, she returned to the vicarage window itself. She traced her fingers lightly over the sill, feeling the faint smudge left behind. Slight, almost imperceptible, but telling. It was here, she knew, that the final pieces of the puzzle would converge. The person responsible had returned, perhaps out of necessity, perhaps to watch the investigation unfold. And human nature being what it was, one false move would expose them. Miss Marple's eyes rested on the faint indentation in the soil beneath the window, the small footprint, delicate, precise. She recalled the buttons, the faint scratches, and the anonymous letter. Someone in St. Mary Mead had gone to great lengths to conceal their actions. Yet concealment, she reminded herself, was never perfect. A shadow moved across the garden, fleeting and tentative. Miss Marple did not call out. She did not give chase. She simply observed, knitting her mental map of gestures, hesitations, and small clues. By evening, she convened another small gathering at her cottage. This time, she included Mrs. Bantry and the lodger, keeping conversation light and casual, discussing minor events of the day. But with each remark, Miss Marple wove a subtle psychological test. Hints of the vicarage window, casual references to the fate, and indirect inquiries about movements and observations. Each guest responded in character. Mrs. Bantry remained careful, polite, yet perceptibly uneasy. The lodger's responses were straightforward, but cautious, honest, yet mindful. Miss Marple's observations sharpened with each answer, each flicker of the eye, each micro-gesture. She noted the smallest inconsistencies, the slightest hesitations, and the subtle tension in posture. These, she knew, were the fingerprints of human truth, far more reliable than any circumstantial evidence or hurried assumption. By the end of the evening, Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction. The threads were converging. The guilty party, clever though they were, could not entirely suppress their nature. That night, she sat by the fire, knitting slowly, her mind reviewing the day's interactions. The village had revealed itself, layer by layer, each subtle clue reinforcing her developing theory. The anonymous letter, the fleeting shadow near the window, the faint smudges, and the delicate buttons, all pointed toward a single deliberate conclusion. She murmured to herself, patience, observation, and the quiet truths of human nature, always the most reliable guides. The person responsible has left hints, even if unintentionally, and soon, very soon, they will reveal themselves in full. Outside, the wind stirred faintly, brushing against the vicarage window. Miss Marple's eyes followed the slight movement of a curtain. She did not need to rush. Human behavior, she knew, would betray even the most careful deception. And when that moment came, she would be ready. Chapter 9. The reveal approaches. St. Mary Mead awoke to another tranquil morning. But tranquility, Miss Marple knew, was a fragile thing. Beneath the surface of quiet streets and polite greetings, currents of suspicion and fear ran deep, and Miss Marple, as ever, was attuned to the subtleties of those currents. Her morning began with a visit to the vicarage garden. The dew still clung to the roses, their petals heavy with moisture. She moved slowly, deliberately, noting the faint smudges along the windowsill, the delicate footprint in the soil, and the subtle shift in shadow as the sun rose. Every detail mattered. Every small imperfection in the careful facade was a clue. Miss Marple paused by the flower bed. The imprint in the soil had been slightly disturbed overnight, as though someone had approached again, perhaps testing the scene or ensuring that no evidence remained. She crouched, examining the disturbance closely. The spacing of the footprints, light and precise, suggested someone nimble, careful, but not entirely practiced. There was a rhythm to the steps, a cadence she recognized from long experience as deliberate, yet anxious. Later, she visited Mrs. Bantry, who was arranging flowers for an afternoon gathering at the vicarage. The hostess appeared calm, but Miss Marple noticed the subtle tension in her shoulders and the slight twitch of her fingers. The human body, she reflected, rarely lies. Even the most composed individuals betray small truths through gesture, posture, and micro-expression. "Good morning, Jane," Mrs. Bantry said warmly, though her smile faltered slightly. "I hope you are not weary from all your observations?" "Not at all," Miss Marple replied. "Observing people is, in a way, much like tending a garden. One must notice both the blossoms and the weeds." Mrs. Bantry's eyes flickered toward the vicarage window. Miss Marple noted it silently. The remark was casual, but the glance suggested awareness, perhaps even concern. By mid-morning, the lodger from Grey Cottage arrived at the vicarage, carrying a small basket of pastries. Her movements were careful, precise, but there was an underlying tension Miss Marple detected immediately. "I thought these might be useful for the gathering," the lodger said, her voice steady but slightly strained. I wanted to help." Miss Marple nodded, taking note of her demeanor. "Kindness is always appreciated," she replied, "and attention to detail, as you show, is equally valuable. The smallest oversight can sometimes reveal what the largest effort conceals." The lodger's hands trembled imperceptibly as she placed the basket on the table. Miss Marple's eyes followed, noting the slight hesitation, the pause that spoke of unease and perhaps fear. As the afternoon approached, the gathering at the vicarage commenced. Villagers trickled in, exchanging polite greetings and casual chatter. Miss Marple observed from the corner of the room, knitting quietly as she let her eyes roam. Mr. Pritchard, usually eager to dominate conversation, seemed unusually reserved. His glances toward the window were cautious, almost measured. Mrs. Price Ridley, meanwhile, busied herself with arranging refreshments, her movements precise but strained. Miss Marple noted everything, the way hands gripped teacups, the subtle tension in shoulders, the half-avoided eye contact. All were data points in her mental map, clues that would soon converge. A sudden gust of wind moved through the open windows, causing a curtain near the vicarage window to flutter. Miss Marple's eyes followed the movement, the timing subtle but telling, suggested someone had lingered near the window shortly before the gathering began. She waited, observing the villagers' reactions. Mrs. Bantry's hand tightened slightly over a plate of sandwiches. Mr. Pritchard's gaze flicked briefly toward the window, then back to his companion, as if to reassure himself. Even the lodger seemed momentarily distracted, her focus straying toward the sill. Miss Marple's mind worked quietly, piecing together patterns she had noted over the past week. The buttons, the footprints, the handprint, the anonymous letter, and now these micro-reactions during a social gathering. Each was a thread leading to the truth. As the sun dipped lower, Miss Marple decided it was time to provoke the subtle response she sought. She spoke lightly, almost as an aside, about the vicarage window and the events of the fete. "Windows are curious things," she remarked, "aren't they? One might see shadows or miss something entirely. Even the smallest movement near them can change everything." Mrs. Price Ridley stiffened imperceptibly, her fingers pausing mid-arrangement. Mr. Pritchard shifted slightly, a faint crease appearing on his forehead. The lodger's hands faltered for just a moment, and her eyes darted toward the vicarage window. Miss Marple continued with the same gentle cadence, sprinkling in mentions of overlooked details, shadows, and the timing of certain events. She did not accuse, did not press. Instead, she observed. An observation, she knew, would reveal more than direct questioning ever could. By the evening, the threads had begun to converge clearly in her mind. The combination of subtle reactions, physical traces, and the known sequence of events pointed unerringly toward one individual. The person had been clever, meticulous even, but they had underestimated the power of patient, quiet observation. Miss Marple reviewed everything mentally: the pearl gray button, the faint footprints, the smudge on the windowsill, the anonymous letter, and the fleeting shadow observed by Thomas Reed. She recalled the responses at the vicarage gathering, the momentary tension, the slight gestures, the fleeting expressions. Her lips curved into a small, knowing smile. The picture was now almost complete. The person who had orchestrated events so carefully could not conceal the truth entirely. The reveal, she knew, was imminent. As darkness fell over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple settled in her chair by the fire. She reflected on the week's observations. Human behavior, subtle but consistent, had exposed more than any overt evidence. The truth was a quiet thing, revealed in hesitation, in avoidance, and in unconscious gestures. She picked up her knitting and worked a few careful stitches, her mind reviewing every detail once more. Outside, the wind whispered through the village streets, and the faint flicker of candlelight in the vicarage window cast shadows across her walls. "Soon," she murmured, "the final pieces will fall into place, and the window that kept secrets will no longer hide them. Human nature, after all, is the most revealing witness of all." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled in the firelight. She had observed, waited, and listened. And now, the moment of revelation, the moment when the cleverest deception would unravel, was at hand. Chapter X. The reveal. The afternoon sun slanted gently through the vicarage windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. The village had gathered in quiet anticipation, a mix of curiosity, apprehension, and the subtle thrill that accompanies the resolution of a long unfolding mystery. Miss Marple, knitting calmly in her chair, waited patiently. She had allowed the pieces to settle, the threads of human behavior to reveal themselves. Now, the final truth would emerge. The vicar cleared his throat. Miss Marple, perhaps you might share your insights with us. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her expression gentle but deliberate. Yes, Reverend, it seems only proper that we understand what has occurred, and in order to do so, one must look carefully at the simplest of details, and at human nature itself. She began by recounting the events of the fete, speaking slowly, deliberately, weaving her narrative like a tapestry. She mentioned the movements near the vicarage window, the small pearl gray button, the faint footprints, and the smudge on the sill. She described the anonymous letter and the careful orchestration of appearances designed to mislead. The truth, she said softly, is rarely concealed entirely. Even the cleverest schemes leave traces, and the smallest gestures often betray the greatest intentions. A tense silence followed. Mrs. Price Ridley's eyes flicked nervously toward Mr. Pritchard, who shifted in his seat, a slight crease forming between his brows. The lodger from Grey Cottage fidgeted with the basket she had brought, her hands betraying nothing but honest concern. Miss Marple's gaze settled finally on Mrs. Bantry, who stiffened slightly. "It is remarkable," she continued, "how easily ordinary human behavior can reveal extraordinary secrets. Each of us reacts to stress, to fear, to guilt, in ways we often do not even notice ourselves, and it is by observing these small reactions that one can discern the truth." Her knitting rested in her lap now, unused, as she leaned forward just slightly. Mr. Quince's death, though sudden and tragic, was not an accident. Someone wished to ensure it appeared so, yet in doing so left the smallest but critical signs. The room remained hushed, each villager holding their breath. Miss Marple allowed a pause, giving the weight of her words a moment to settle. "Consider the movements around the vicarage window, observed by several people," she said. "The smudge on the sill, the footprint below, and the overlooked button all point to one individual's careful but ultimately flawed attempt to stage an accident. And consider the letter sent to Mr. Aldrich, designed to mislead and distract attention. It is clever, yes, but it cannot entirely disguise human nature." She looked directly at Mrs. Price Ridley, whose hands now gripped the edge of her chair. The person responsible is someone accustomed to observing others, often giving advice or caution, but who allowed anxiety to betray them in a single moment. Mrs. Price Ridley's lips parted slightly, and her eyes widened. I don't understand," she stammered. Miss Marple's voice was soft but firm. "It is unnecessary to speak outright. The evidence lies in the gestures, the careful positioning of oneself during the gathering, the fleeting glances toward the vicarage window, the almost imperceptible tension when attention was drawn to the small details. Every action, subtle though it may be, has spoken clearly." Mrs. Price Ridley's face drained of color. You think it was me?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied gently. "You acted with caution, but caution is not infallible. Human behavior leaves traces, and you left several. You orchestrated an apparent accident, and yet in doing so, you allowed the smallest signs of your involvement to remain. The shadows you moved within, the careful placement of letters and diversions, all point to you." A hush fell over the room. Mrs. Price Ridley's hands trembled as she sank back into her chair. I only wished to protect myself. I did not "I did not intend." Miss Marple nodded quietly. "Intentions are rarely as invisible as we believe. The human heart, under pressure, reveals the truth in ways we cannot always control. You intended secrecy, but your actions betrayed you. And now, the village knows the truth." Mr. Pritchard exhaled sharply, and the lodger from Grey Cottage seemed relieved, yet shaken by the clarity of the revelation. Mrs. Bantry, though composed, looked slightly startled, realizing how close deception had lain within her familiar community. The vicar cleared his throat once more. "Thank you, Miss Marple. It is unsettling to see the truth so plainly, but I suppose that is what justice requires." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes soft but discerning. "Justice, Reverend, is often found not in punishment alone, but in understanding. Human nature, with all its flaws and subtleties, must be acknowledged and observed if one is to prevent further harm." Outside, the wind rustled the trees gently, a calm settling over St. Mary Mead that seemed almost tangible. The villagers exchanged quiet words, some of apology, some of reassurance, all tinged with the relief that clarity brings. Miss Marple returned to her cottage that evening, her knitting needles clicking softly in the lamplight. She reflected on the week's observations, the subtle glances, the gestures, the overlooked details that had revealed the truth. Human nature, she thought, was the most reliable witness of all. As she sipped her tea, the village now resting in the gentle quiet of evening, she allowed herself a small smile. Another mystery had been resolved, not through force or accusation, but through patience, careful observation, and the understanding that the truth often lies in what is left unsaid. The window that had kept its secrets for so long now reflected only the fading light, its story told, and Miss Marple, quietly content, knew that in St. Mary Mead, as in life, human nature was a puzzle worth observing, piece by piece.